Hey everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. I think that covered what you need to know about me. Background is web development, accessibility, like in kind of real world contexts, and then moved into product management on an accessibility product. So this is a lightning talk, and we're going to try to touch on a lot of different topics related to accessibility, maybe give you some more resources to dig into if you're not so familiar with it. And generally, make sure you're aware of the context you might need as a front-end developer working in Vue. So let's dive right into it. So first of all, if you are new to accessibility, the way I like to explain it is as a way of thinking about the web that prioritizes the needs of people with disabilities. This is slightly different than some of the other definitions you might see out there, but really absorbing that when we think about basically anything on the web, the question in the back of our minds should be, how is this usable by people who don't necessarily use a mouse or look at the page visually to understand what's there? And if we can get that way into the back of our thinking about everything we build, accessibility kind of flows naturally from that. And there's a lot of good things that come with that as well. Accessibility is also just a way to talk about the technical process of designing and developing high-quality software that meets those needs. So we roll it into the quality process, and we think of good front-end code as being accessible code for various reasons. But focusing again on the actual people at the other side of it is the easiest way to gain clarity about the front end and what to do to make something accessible. And lastly, this is an ongoing effort. You're not going to find a silver bullet or something like a component library or anything that magically fixes it in one single project or transition. Accessibility is something that you're going to deal with kind of on an ongoing basis if you want to be successful maintaining an accessible experience. One of the big things that's happening with accessibility right now is the European Accessibility Act. This is coming into law in June, and this is something that's making a lot of companies who didn't think about accessibility in their work before start to take it more seriously and look at what they can do. Here's what it looks like. It is a long legal document, no big surprises there. And what it does is creates these obligations for member countries of the EU to create accessibility-related legislation. In the last session, like the GDPR kind of came up, this regulation that introduced globally a much bigger presence of privacy notifications, agreements, cookie banners, all of those things that kind of grew up in the last 5 or 10 years since the GDPR was introduced. To me, that's the most similar impact in recent memory of what we're expecting with the European Accessibility Act, where the European Accessibility Act is actually going to affect a lot of companies internationally simply by doing business with consumers within the EU. This is just an example of what the GDPR used to do. So the enforcement of the European Accessibility Act is really interesting. It is up to the member countries to decide how to do it. In my home country, which is Ireland, the fines can go up to $60,000 or 60,000 euros and include prison time. So officers of companies who are continuously failing to comply with accessibility criteria are liable to experience like jail time for not doing what they need to do. On the other hand, the defense for this is diligence. It's taking precautions to make sure what you're shipping is accessible and functional for people with disabilities and creates an equal experience. The goal here is not perfection. The goal is just to be making something good enough to be credible and seriously usable independently by people with disabilities. You will always have small areas of non-compliance and things that ship and don't work and require feedback. And being engaged in that feedback and making an effort, at least most of the time, seems to be enough to comply with these laws. So you want to hit that standard and reach a really good level. I'd add that I'm not a lawyer. What you should do if you're looking at this and going like, does this apply to me as a front-end developer? Ask your legal and compliance people if this affects you. If you have customers in the EU that are not like B2B customers, this seems to be, for a lot of the companies I talk to, that the trigger for having an effect of the Accessibility Act. So it covers quite a lot of like e-commerce type businesses. So let's talk about like how you can do something about accessibility in your Vue components. And the reason to think about this is often the way you find out about accessibility is not someone talking to you at a conference or teaching you in how they teach web development. It is somebody walks around your office holding a demand letter they've received, and they're like, where are these highly paid professional front-end developers who are writing HTML that is causing us to be sued? That's the kind of consequence of not being accessible when the company does not take it seriously and somebody has trouble completing workflows independently that they're supposed to be entitled to do by law and things like that. So we don't want that demand letter. We want to be able to say what we ship as front-end developers is high quality professional grade code and that it's functional for disabled users by default. The reason this is important is a lot of accessibility problems happen accidentally when the code and the content just don't agree with each other in some important way. And there's a few different aspects to how you might think of what's matching and not matching. We'll get into one or two examples before the end of the talk. But this is the root of it. It matters what HTML we ship to users because browsers use that HTML to create accessible experiences for assistive technology users. These are all useful things to look at. And when you pick a component library or something, you should investigate the accessibility of that library. It is a great advantage to be starting with an accessible component library or one that's at least trying to be accessible. So understanding those capabilities of what you're using is a lot easier than reinventing the wheel, especially if you're new to it. The only thing I would caution you to do is don't transfer the accountability around accessibility to a third party. You still own the experience your users have, so you should still understand and test for accessibility. The reason this is hard to test for and maintain, which is kind of the topic here, is that code is always changing. Each change to the code can have ripple effects that affect accessibility. And so you might not know the accessibility effect. Accessibility issues, the ones that
Hey, Mark, do you have another Wi-Fi or internet that you could attach to?
is built on top of an inaccessible foundation, which is a problem. And people shift accessibility testing left, which is kind of in the
Mark?
QA shift left movement. We want developers at getting accessibility feedback in component tests and end-to-end tests that run before code is merged, and generally get the feedback as early as you can so that you can correct accessibility issues. So how do we keep those things? If we've done everything correctly and we've built an accessible application, how are we going to achieve that maintenance? Accessibility automation is like a lot of other standards-based things where a Swiss cheese approach can help catch all of the issues, even though no one layer is going to perfectly do things. And eventually, like you see here, some issues are going to make it into production. For accessibility, these are the main forms of accessibility testing that you could do. You can have things that directly monitor production environments. You can go all the way from that layer into CodeLint in your editor. That's like, hey, you create an image called attribute. I'm going to give you a little red squiggly right before you commit that code. The thing I'm kind of interested in, from writing a lot about these in the Cypress docs, if you want to check those out, is how we use accessibility in kind of standard automation tests in Cypress or any other particular testing framework. This sort of library that I'm going to talk about is Axe Core, and this gives you accessibility checks where you don't do anything special except run this library to get a lot of accessibility feedback. And we're kind of here, so I don't want to spend too much in the weeds of Axe Core, but it is a part of Lighthouse. If you've ever seen an accessibility score from Lighthouse, that's based on a partial set of Axe Core rules. It's very popular. We use it at Cypress. It's also in a bunch of Cypress open source packages. And the idea is that mismatch of code and content can be detected in a very passive automated scan, because we can see things like you have a list element, but there's no list items inside it. There's other random children. We've got headings that are all the wrong order for someone to intelligently skim through a page when just listening to all the headings announced. There's all these types of things that are easy to detect. It covers about the criteria that we look at. And these 30% have a lot of serious problems, so it's really good to catch them early. Even you will still need some form of manual testing to get a comprehensive understanding of accessibility. Your authority on whether something is accessible is always going to be your disabled users, and are they able to complete workflows and understand your application. One example of a result you get from automation testing bucket show how it's pretty accessible. But most of the content here, like and all that, is in the actual library, just as you would use it in any way.
Hey, Mark, are you able to hear
A
me?
report about form fields missing labels. This form field over here, some warnings present in the accessibility report. Okay, we're back. I'm not going to start this presentation over again from the very beginning, but just to recap, in case some people did like come and go in between, we talked about accessibility as being related to how we make applications that function for disabled users. So somebody who's blind and using a screen reader, any other type of disability that affects the way you use the internet. How do we build software that is going to work for them? And then we mentioned the reason that this is becoming so top of mind for lots of companies right now is the the European Accessibility Act, which goes into force in June this year. It's going to cause a lot of companies to begin to have accessibility obligations, at least compliance-wise, that they didn't have before. So where we kind of started to trail off in the last attempt at this talk was getting into what does this mean for you as a Vue developer? So we had covered a little bit of the general premise that accessibility problems happen when the code and the content don't really match up. So you're seeing one thing on the screen, but it's not reflected at all in the HTML structure, or you can only use things with the mouse, but not with the keyboard because the HTML is not supporting those interactions. The underlying idea here is that it matters what HTML we ship to users in our component. And then I think this is where the audio began to fall apart. This example is a classic of a button that's missing discernible text. So in this case, there's no label for anybody to understand this button other than visually. It's just a thumbs up SVG icon. The way that this affects accessibility is the browser's accessibility tree. This is the API that every assistive technology can use to pick up a version of your web page that's translatable into Braille and into voice for screen readers, or can respond to a voice control command, like telling your interface to like this button, something like that. So this core aspect of like, how are we making the HTML good enough that the browser can make an accessibility tree that makes sense? This is a part of what we're doing when we create Vue components and we make pieces of the UI. There's a number of solutions to any accessibility problem. In this case, the ARIA label is an attribute you can add to the element that will provide a non-visual label that the browser will build into the accessibility tree. So that gives somebody who's listening to this be described a sense of what happens with the button. Without this attribute, there's no knowing for them what could possibly take place when you press the button. It could do something really important. It could delete their whole account. It's very frustrating and confusing to have interfaces where buttons are not labeled, and makes the experience one where the person using it has to ask for help from somebody else to complete a task, which is not the experience you want users to have. Independence is like core to all of us. So there are some Vue component libraries that ship with accessibility in mind. And so Vuetify, Prime Vue, and Core UI are ones I looked at this morning that have accessibility kind of statements and documentation on their website. They explain how they're exposing things you can use to influence the accessibility tree, like slots and things like that, to provide the appropriate names and labels for everything. And they also explain some limitations around what a library can do for you versus what you have to own yourself, like how you use it, how you nest the components, and things like that. All libraries are going to ship with some accessibility flaws as well. It's very hard to completely crush everything. And so the thing I would advise people to do if you're making things in Vue using something like this is don't count on the fact that it's an accessible library to produce an accessible experience 100% of the time. It's great that there's this head start that these developers that make these things have shipped with accessibility in mind, but your accountability for what your users experience still lies with you. There's a lot of reasons that code is hard, or accessibility is hard, mainly because code changes so much and you don't always predict the ripple effects. So accessibility problems can happen in ways that quickly kind of pile on top of each other, and unpacking multiple things that are built in an inaccessible way and are all interrelated can be a big project. accessibility is easier and better and faster to do if we move it to the left of the development cycle into development, into early component testing, into end-to-end testing. These are the ways that we can approach accessibility and fix issues as fast as possible without them becoming load-bearing and complex production issues that you have to make a whole project to fix. So testing, component testing, end-to-end testing are important pieces of the puzzle, like how we detect and fix accessibility problems. The approach that many organizations take is really kind of a Swiss cheese approach. There's browser extensions, there's production monitoring, there is linters and things like that in the code. And so you can test accessibility for some things right there with little red squiggly lines in your editor with extensions to your code editor that do that. You can also set something to scan your website every week or two and try to crawl through some things to see what's happening in production. And then maybe most relevant for people who are writing code and tests is this set in here, where we use libraries to help us do big accessibility checks. I've been writing and thinking a lot about this for the last year. So in the Cypress docs, we have kind of every angle on this that I've been able to think of already. But the one to introduce you today is this package called AxeCore, which is able to do accessibility checks that are just taking place in an end-to-end or a component test that will check the DOM at that moment in time. So here we had AxeCore by DQ Systems. This is the library that's used. If you've ever seen Lighthouse produce an accessibility score, this is under the hood what's happening in Lighthouse. We use it at Cypress in our kind of paid products, and it's also in a bunch of accessibility testing plugins that you can use, like Cypress Axe. You've probably heard of this if you've touched on accessibility at all as a developer, but if you're brand new to it, this is the idea. Pardon me just a second here. Great. So the idea of what AxeCore can do is what static analysis can check for. And in this case, static analysis can look at about 30% of these web content accessibility guidelines. And I know we're going fast and I'm throwing out a lot of terminology, so there is resources at the end of this. So that will explain some of these things in more detail. But if you look at those criteria that tell us, is an experience accessible, we can detect a lot of important failures of those criteria with something like AxeCore. This is just an example now of how automation might surface an issue for accessibility and the kind of debugging workflow you would do. So again, if this is a sort of new topic for you, you can expect the cycle I'm showing here to be something you would go through multiple times in multiple different ways with different issues that might get surfaced. What we're seeing at a glance, though, is the information about form fields having missing labels. So in this report, which is the AxeCore report in Cypress Cloud, but it's the same as the type of information you would get in other ways, we see two issues are failing here related to the username and password field not having labels. So how do we debug this? They look like they have labels. I might have made a pull request to just move the labels around. So we're going to understand, how did moving those labels around break accessibility? What does it even matter? Visually, we inspect the element and it looks okay. So what's the report about? I'm showing here a way to print the element to the console, but the idea is really just to get into DevTools. All of your browsers have accessibility tree information in them at this point. So you should be able to look at the accessibility tree based on this part of the DOM and open that up. It's in the area of your DevTools where the styles are and all that sort of thing. It's usually the last option in Chrome, for example, under here. But the purpose of getting in here is to understand what's actually making its way through to this part of the browser that users could depend on. And you can see various other aspects of accessibility are called out here. So understanding there's really no name, just like the violation might have said, hey, we're missing a label. Okay, I'm on a text box, it has no name. You can understand you need some way to wire these things up to make it make sense. When we inspect the label, as you look at a result from something like AxeCore, there's always a lot more information in the related links to DQ University. They're the makers of AxeCore. And they would tell you that one way to wire up a label is to use the for attribute between the label and the form field. So if we added that in just to the label itself, because the form field has the ID of username, what we should see in the browser DevTools is that we see the name populated in here. This is a really good debugging workflow if you're like me and you usually use DevTools for CSS bugs and stuff like that. When somebody reports an accessibility issue, you can immediately be like, let me fool around in DevTools and see what I can get to happen to fix the problem. That's the core workflow that will help you dive in and quickly understand, is the accessibility issue real, what's happening, and experiment, and then see live results in there. So I recommend this no matter how you're doing your testing to be able to get into the DevTools like that. In this case, fixing that type of attribute would produce now a fully passing report that we see on the bottom. And my takeaways from this is that form fields are really important. If you're looking at this and going, I'm not sure the label matters that much, a lot of our important business functions and websites go through forms. So if somebody can't sign up, if they can't contact you, if they can't give you money because your interface is not accessible, there's really tangible effects to that. And the most important one to me is they can't contact you to tell you they're not having a good time with accessibility. So if you have working forms and a broadly accessible experience, you can receive feedback from real users about how to get more accessible. I have a few thoughts to wrap up here. This is such a kind of whistle-stop tour through various accessibility concepts. I would say the most important thing is to focus on the user. Getting that feedback is the absolute gold standard. When you are looking at automation, you want to catch problems that are suitable to catch with automation, like that layer in your Swiss cheese approach. There's a bunch of things you can learn in response to any given accessibility issue. And one thing I've found with a lot of the people that I've worked with on accessibility is you might see an issue in your Axe Core report or your Lighthouse report that says buttons must have discernible text. And what you really want to do is just put a Band-Aid on and fix that issue and move on. But often what you experience is that indicates that that whole area could use more attention. So that's where you might focus your manual testing, get a screen reader out and see what the experience is, look at the overall accessibility tree. Because if we didn't do the things that Axe Core catches, it's likely we didn't do the more sophisticated stuff that requires a human judgment to catch. There's a lot of different resources here. The first two, I just want to take a second to go through them, and then I think we'll be done with the presentation and can switch back to your normal programming and get some questions in as well if we have time. This How a Screen Reader User Surfs the Web is a really eye-opening video of just like, okay, when you use a screen reader, you're skimming headings, you're checking all the links on the page, you're doing all sorts of non-linear stuff that you might not think of if you're used to imagining the accessibility experience as kind of working through the document. Actually comes at it from many different angles. Next is the Homer Gaines article. This is a really simple, straightforward introduction to accessibility principles of the foundation principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, that drive all the accessibility criteria. Next, there's the Vue docs, and there's also this Pay What You Want ebook called Accessible Vue that has a bunch of patterns that might be interesting to you, and you can just browse that on the website to get a sense of what's in there. It addresses a bunch of different, how to use slots and props in ways that are good for accessibility, things like that. At the bottom, there's a bunch of links to articles and talks and things I've given that are in more detail about how to do some of this debugging. This has been like a part of my life for a long time as a developer, and in writing Vue things, I had to go on a bit of a journey to, learn to write well accessibly. And I think there's always room for improvement. So these are some resources that I hope are kind of friendly and approachable. So I will pause there and see if we have any questions or anything that I can answer at this point. Just let me know.
We do. We have time for a few questions. Let's see. Do the sites need to have an .eu ending for this to be enforced?
No. So it works just like the kind of GDPR regulations where it is applied to dealing with European citizens. So if I'm a citizen of Ireland, which I am, and I'm using a website, it doesn't really matter where in the world I am for the privacy regulation to apply to me. Likewise, for companies all around the world who do business in the EU, if you're serving European customers, that's where the obligation comes in. I'm sure the enforcement is different if you're not based in those countries, because it's harder to enforce some company that's based elsewhere. but it definitely does not just apply to like EU domains or European companies.
Thank you. All right. They use the WebAIM Wave as a initial test for the accessibility. Can you recommend any other tools, please?
So yeah, Wave is fantastic. Axcore is the other one I mentioned, and because that's built into some other tools, that's an extension you can use in the browser as well. And one thing I've kind of learned, there are a few others. IBM has an equal access checker, a few things that come to mind. What I've seen recommended, though, is not necessarily to bounce around different tools that are going to tell you different things, that you might want to have just a consistent set of results. So the automation is telling you the same thing. And for me, that's Axcore, because Axcore has linters, it has plugins for all of the testing things you could be using, it has a browser extension. And so you can get great agreement and alignment between seeing something in Axcore and then having it send it over to a developer, and they're going to also see that in their automation tests. It's going to all agree with itself. So even though that you can get slightly different insights from 3 or 4 types of accessibility testing tools, you might want to focus on one to kind of start with at least.
And I'm going with this question next because they're using Wave as well. Do you know of a list of testing tools that may cover YCAG 2.0 level AA requirements specifically, or the ones that you just listed do?
They do to the extent that automation can cover them. And most of the tools have a way for you to filter to just that set of results as well. So it should be possible even using Wave, which I'm the least experienced with Wave because I've been in the Axe world for a while. But yeah, being able to filter to just the criteria that match the standard you want should be okay.
Great, thank you. And last question. One of the problems we have is knowing when it's enough. How do we determine when the website is ready for screen readers?
That's a really interesting one. You have a few options because you're never going to know it's perfect. If you are kind of what we call Axe clean or clean in your automated accessibility reports, that means you have either solved all of the kind of labeling and automatically detected things, and you're in a good baseline for accessibility users. It doesn't have to wait for that, though. If you have people who can give you feedback, then it's very hard for me to say there's a definite line. But I do think of 3 levels that I think make sense to think about. The first is basic usability. So this is trying to get the automation straight and trying to maybe look around yourself with a keyboard and maybe use a screen reader, even if you're not really good with them. Just make sure the experience makes some sense, or look in the accessibility tree. So like as developers not experienced in accessibility, we should have some confidence of being basically usable. And that's where I'd start to get feedback. But the 2 levels above that are like, okay, we want to comply with the web content accessibility guidelines, which are extensive and cover a lot of things. That is a compliance aspect of it that sometimes is a layer above basic usability. And then real usability it actually is a meaningful, correct experience for screen reader users. And you have validation from people who like use screen readers or use other assistive technology, that it's not an annoying, repetitive experience, that it's like functional for them and they can experience everything they need to. But once you're at basic usability, I would say you can ship it. And as long as you commit to responding to feedback, basic usability should get you able to respond to feedback and have users. That would probably be my recommendation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bearing with me on the internet. It usually works just like this. So hopefully this was a lot better than earlier. I appreciate it a lot.
Yes, the internet had decided to allow us. They were on our side for this one. So thank you again.
Yeah, thanks.